Hey, Randy Joe here, and this is 1000 Reviews, the series where I plan on reviewing every single album from the 1001 Albums to Listen To Before You Die book. And today we are looking at Country Joe and the Fish's 1967 album, Electric Music for the Mind and Body. Now, Country Joe and the Fish released this underneath the Vanguard label, produced by Samuel Charters with art direction uncredited, nationality USA, and a running time of just 44 minutes and 3 seconds. Now, Country Joe and the Fish is a relatively unknown band to most. However, their early influence in the psychedelic genre is definitely felt in future bands to come, as they were jumping onto a psychedelic bandwagon that hasn't quite taken off to the great extent that it would in the late 60s. And on top of that, Country Joe and the Fish stem from San Francisco, and the San Francisco psychedelic scene was at the time just starting to take off with other musicians at the time, such as Jefferson Airplane. In fact, Jefferson Airplane get a nod from Country Joe and the Fish in this album in the last track, Grace, which is a tribute to the singer, Grace Slick. But going back to the beginning of this album, it kicks off with the song Flying High, which right off the bat really just shows the psychedelic and raw guitar sounds up against a much more smoothly and cleanly produced percussion and backup instrumentation. The guitar work feels very vibrant and visceral in this track. They're much more raw, especially throughout this entire album, feeling like the main focus of the album, as the guitar work really does ooze this very psychedelic acid trip-like sound. They're really luscious and stand out among this instrumentation. And Country Joe is the lead vocalist of this band, and with Flying High, I find that he tends to be a little more flat and bland. He doesn't offer up a whole lot in terms of style or even in vocal range. His voice here does sound pretty standard and run-of-the-mill, and he doesn't really push it to any great extents. And in this song, even though I do like the chorus, the rest of it I find him to be just overall very one-dimensional. And like how the first track, Flying High, has a great focus on the guitar work, the second track here, Not So Sweet Martha Lorraine, has a much stronger focus on the organ playing, as it definitely stands out here with its much more raw and visceral approach. And I would say alongside this amazing organ playing, there is also the drumming that also stands out and really feels like a great parallel alongside the organ. They really complement one another and come together to create a very nice and complementive unified sound. The rattling cymbals really add a lot of height to Country Joe's voice among the choruses as things start to peak up in the track. And I also enjoy Country Joe's vocals on this one more than the opener, as his approach here feels more like talking and less like singing, and definitely feels a lot more natural and mixed into the sound rather than something that feels as if it is just completely out of focus. But among this 44 minutes of psychedelic rock, the fifth track on here, Section 43, definitely pushes things to a much more larger instrumental and structurally loose song, which is definitely a highlight among this album, as it doesn't really stay in one place for too long and takes a lot of different detours in terms of its sound. I definitely like how this feels like a jam session of sorts, with how loose it is to its approach and how the structure of it isn't very linear. It's almost like multiple parts being sewn together by this very loose jam session. The heavily shifting organ here and the queasy guitars really bounce off one another and complement one another as if they are creating sort of competition between the two. And it really does feel like a very luscious and wild drug trip as it just continues to go on for 7 minutes. But that really is the best track, I would say, on the album. This 7-minute epic really feels like it stands out among a lot of songs that don't have that much more to offer than their contemporaries at the time. The Masked Marauder, for example, is a very bland track overall that, even though the instrumentation is pretty enjoyable, Country Joe just literally repeats la 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 over and over for the lyrics. It feels as if it is very rushed and quickly put together and just tossed on this album to really pad out time. And even though there is a harmonica portion in this track that I enjoy quite a bit, definitely more so than anywhere else on the album, this harmonica portion is only about 10 seconds in this entire 4-minute track. So it really feels as if this track was just kind of lazily put together and at the end of the day doesn't offer that much up. Or even the song Sad and Lonely Times, which really feels like Country Joe is going with a much more mainstream approach with his vocals here, carrying on this very softly sung traditional 60s kind of voice alongside the rough and raw production, which really feels as if Country Joe is playing it a bit too safe. And then finally, the closing track here, Grace, is, like I said earlier, a tribute track to Jefferson Airplane singer Grace Slick, which you can feel a lot of the influence coming from Jefferson Airplane onto this album. And over the span of this 7 minutes of Grace, I feel as if it is ultimately still quite the letdown. And I guess that's how I feel overall about the entire album, because with a title like Electric Music for the Body and Soul, I expected things to be a lot more visceral and a lot more forward-thinking in the psychedelic rock sound. And even though at the time it might have seemed a bit out there, now in this day and age it definitely feels quite dated and uninteresting when compared up next to the others who were doing the same thing at the same time. Even Jefferson Airplane, who they consistently take influence from and go as far to dedicate a tribute track to, have already surpassed them in the psychedelic rock sound in San Francisco at the time. So ultimately I feel as if this is just a overall weak approach to the genre, which is really unfortunate because I was expecting a bit more from this thing. So with all that being said, the soft rating of this album came to a 6.7 out of 10, and I will leave the hard rating as well at a 6.7 out of 10. And obviously, as I've said, I feel as if this album is ultimately, in the end, a bit underwhelming and isn't something of a must listen to music listeners. I would go ahead and say that this is an NE for not essential. I don't think it is something that you must hear before you die. If you're following this book here in chronological order, you would have already heard psychedelic rock done better than this album here. So at the end of the day, it is not essential. All right, let's see what the next album you're listening to is in the 1001 Albums Listened to Before You Die book. Random number generator, 1 to 1001. Generate 306, which will be the album Eric Clapton's 461 Ocean Boulevard. So go ahead and listen to Eric Clapton's 461 Ocean Boulevard, and I'll review that in exactly 1 week from now. Anyways, that pretty much does it for this video. If you like this video, please hit like and subscribe if you want to follow along and listen to every album from the 1001 Albums Listened to Before You Die book. And as always, my name is Randy Joe, and I'm signing off.